standard, when it is rarely simple to achieve consensus on a singular technical issue. Let's use mental health concerns, and for the purposes of our review, we will say stress, as a bridge to some practical examples of the development of health problems from stress on the job. In a recent review, Susan Doerksen indicated that employees with low-paying, insecure, stagnant jobs were a third more likely to experience health problems than would a happily employed individual. This, for example, has tremendous implications for the U.S. as it moves more deeply into a service economy. With advancements in technology, a deepening service economy, and overall business economic problems, Ms. Doerksen reports that nearly 1/2 of all adult workers experience some stress on their job. The elements of this stress include a lack of medical insurance, little or no opportunities for advancement, the fear of losing a job or actually having lost a job, and being insecure economically. 61% of the individuals tracked in the research, which Ms. Doerksen reported on, were found to have at least one health problem, ranging from serious back pain, alcoholism, increased cigarette smoking, and emotional problems which interfered with work. In 1993, the National Institute for Occupational Health and Safety, the research and development arm of the United States Federal Safety Statutory Body, indicated that over 11% of all occupational disease claims filed were for mental disorders. The study they conducted went on to say that the average cost of managing these cases was $11,000, compared to $5,000 for all other injury and illness claims. As we have discussed, technology advancements have been blamed for creating their fair share of creating job stress. But there are also examples of technology reducing stress and improving safety performance. One such example is the use of a voice recognition equipment in dangerous environments where it is very important to have workers' hands free. Such is the case in the logging industry for a job known as a scaler. A scaler must measure, inventory, determine the species, and categorize defects of logs which have been delivered to a mill. In the past, most scalers would try to accomplish all of these tasks and operate a handheld radio. Complicating the processes are the environmental conditions the loggers work in. This dynamic applies whether the logger is in the northeast of the U.S. or in Central America. With the advent of voice recognition recorders, scalers can now work with their eyes always on the action and record all pertinent data remotely through a radio headset mounted on their hard hats. Production has been improved and work is now more safe, as a scaler can pay more attention to his surroundings as opposed to all the tools and equipment he is to use in his job. The stresses of work, at a minimum, decrease productivity and result in illness attributable to work. At the other end of the spectrum, workers under stress lose the ability to cope, and the responses can be catastrophic, such as in the case of violence in the workplace. Not all violent episodes in the workplace originated with co-workers or subordinates, however. But the simple stress of potential violence, or knowing you work in an industry with higher levels of violence, casts a whole new light on safety requirements on the job. Unfortunately, violence at work is global. In the U.S., as many as 2.2 million workers a year are the victims of physical attacks in the workplace, and another 6.3 million are threatened. Of the 6,000 workers who were killed at work in 1992, 1,000 were the victims of homicide. These attacks result in 1.7 million lost days of work and $55 million of lost wages each year. Internationally, violent events are up for a variety of reasons. Many are committed for simple economic gain, while other violent attacks are the result of religious, political, and other historical conflicts, such as is the case with drug trafficking territories. Kidnapping has become a major concern, one of the United States' preeminent kidnap response firms, Corporate Risk International, responded to over 100 kidnap and extortion incidents in the first half of 1996 alone. 33% of these incidents took place in the United States, while another 33% occurred in South America. Mexico and Central America combined had 11% of the total, while Africa had 13%. Clearly, kidnap, ransom, and extortion are unique elements of violence in the workplace. But as our world shrinks due to faster travel and access to information, more and more individuals will be exposed. The response to violence in the workplace has been varied, but it clearly is an event that cannot be ignored. The state of California in the United States has developed a model response program to assist with workplace security. This is a non-binding requirement, but nonetheless, employers in the United States are still required to protect their employees from violent acts while on the job and could be held responsible under other statutes. Hopefully, I've been able to share with you some of the areas of exposure that by controlling, you will both decrease the potential for injury and illness and increase productivity. When considering such events as violence and terrorist-related activities, it is clear that the playing field for managing the health and safety of workers at all levels of an organization has been greatly expanded. Each of these areas could easily be a session unto themselves. As a conclusion, let's take a look at some control strategies. First, if there is an agreement that exposure to injury and illness occurs along a continuum, two factors must be built into your control strategies. The first of which is you have to take some action. This action may simply be the development of exposure recognition capabilities, or it may be a quick, decisive attack on a particular trend of occurrences. Both have particular importance. By developing a system to recognize the potential for adverse work-related outcomes to occur, you can head some events off. So, what do you include in this system? Utilization of industry resources, such as journals, newsletters, seminars, and the like, can speed this process and assure you that you are not alone in your desire to control exposures and resolve problems. Respond to experiential data. As you see trends develop, for example, cumulative trauma disorders, undertake studies to determine the etiology. You will find it increasingly important to involve workers in this process, as they often have tremendous ideas for improvement. By doing so, you also work toward improving their behavior. Anecdotal information may prove extremely valuable, so don't discount it. When in casual conversations, employees share stories or anecdotes with you, be prepared to respond. In the case of violence, in the workplace issues, the use of casual comments and statements can be a trigger for worse things to come. For example, I currently have a student in one of my classes who knew the engineering student who shot the 3 San Diego State University professors. He spoke of surprise that the student would do something like this, but he quickly followed with the statement that the student was quirky, and he knew that someday he would do something weird. At the very least, if the professors knew of the student's concerns, they may have been able to watch for indicators of unusual behavior and respond accordingly. The activities I just mentioned are perhaps some of the most basic that you can undertake. The advantages, however, is that they are cost-effective, tend to yield quick results, and set the stage for whether or not additional, more in-depth studies are required. I would urge your involvement in the standard setting process. It is much better for you to be in on those developmental activities and have a say in how the standard looks than to simply have to comply with the work of others. Exposures to workers which come from the chemical realms require managers to consider the following thought process and guidelines in order to determine if controls can be established. Can you engineer out the need for the harmful chemical? Or can the chemical be reformulated to reduce its unsafe characteristics? Secondly, is it possible to substitute the chemical in question with one less harmful. Consider revising processes where possible, which diminish the need for the questionable chemical or others which may prove harmful as well. Look into segregating workers physically from harmful processes. And, lastly, provide appropriate personal protective gear for workers who must come into contact with hazardous substances. It is crucial that employers not rely on single bullet tactics. Once process improvements have been put in place, they must be given a chance to succeed. When considering stress, cumulative trauma disorders, and in some cases behavior, which is an indicator of potential violence in the workplace, the key to success hinges on worker involvement and behavior modification. Some recommendations to control mental and physical stress on the job include: reduce or eliminate physical hazards associated with jobs. For example, use equipment which is less noisy, better maintained, and that has the appropriate guards in place. Improve the working environment through industrial hygiene measures. Make sure workers understand the goals of an organization and what their role in accomplishing these goals is. Plan and communicate changes which are forthcoming. Involve employees in the change process. In fact, since there will always be change, consistently maintain some involvement activities. Where at all possible, modify tasks so they allow worker input and control. Do not underestimate the social value of work. Therefore, minimize the segregation of workers where possible. California has recognized, for example, 3 distinct circumstances associated with violence in the workplace. These include those acts brought on by someone a worker does not know, such as a robbery in a retail establishment. The second type of violence is that which is committed by someone who is the recipient of goods or services from an establishment. Some of the more common cases involve attacks on teachers, as we have described, and as was witnessed at a United Kingdom elementary school earlier in 1996. The last type of exposure to violence, which has been distinguished, is that from someone who has employment-related involvement at the establishment where the act of violence takes place. Such are the cases with former spouses and lovers, management or supervisory representative, and fellow employees. Important steps to take in the management of violence include communication of the intolerance of violence and the assessments of hazards, both of which include physical and program dynamics. It is also important to investigate all incidences of violence, regardless of their magnitude, and take corrective action. Lastly, employees must be trained in the recognition of hazards and their response requirements. As a resource, a copy of the California Model Injury and Illness Prevention Program for Workplace Security is included in your package of materials. I certainly have enjoyed the opportunity to share some thoughts on this broad-scoped issue with you and hope they serve to assist you in the fabrication of tactics to mitigate the many exposures workers are faced with and which impact productivity. Thank you.
Let's begin with the first question and answer session. We would like to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that you only make one question per phone call, and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or fax which now appear on your screen. We remind you to make your telephone calls at a distance from the monitor to avoid feedback. The first question is coming from Argentina. Let's listen to the participant of Instituto Nobel Río Tercero. Go ahead. Good morning from Instituto Nobel Río Tercero, Córdoba, Argentina. The question is, can you mention a method for research and administrating risks when working with health? The volume was very low.
Is the question in regards to measuring the impact of administrative controls on health in the workplace?
Parece que se perdió la llamada.
Let me try, if I may, to address the question as I understood it. There are ways to measure the impacts of administrative controls. An administrative control does not change the hazard for a particular task. What it does do is reduce exposure time. It involves numerous people in a task, and there are some benefits to that, such as cross-training. So yes, you can measure that impact, and actually administrative controls in some industries serve to be very good safety and health measures.
Thank you very much. Let's get a question from Mexico, Tepigna Narilles from the Instituto Tecnológico. Good morning. Perdón, ¿podría empezar otra vez? Right now we have acknowledged the fact that the internal mental attitudes of the people help to improve the physical health of people also. The question is, what should organizations do to ensure and stimulate the positive attitude of workers so that they promote not only their health but also their identity and feeling of belonging as well as productivity? Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and I think perhaps Dr. Johnson may have a couple of comments about that too, but let me make a quick effort at that. I mentioned in my presentation the necessity for the involvement of workers in the process of change and educating them to the overall aspects of business. That helps to improve self-esteem. It helps to improve understanding of tasks and activities at work. And the value there is that they tend to be safer and more healthy. So by looking at things along a continuum where we involve workers, we recognize their value, there's no doubt that the literature supports improvements in health and productivity.
Let's greet now the Universidad Nacional de Ingeniería in Lima. Hello? Universidad Nacional de Ingeniería. The question is the following. How can you manage in the developing countries the stress at work when wages and motivations and working conditions are so difficult to change?
Right.
Sí.
Very good question. And one is to be, I think one aspect to the answer is to be patient and recognize that changes will not happen overnight. I believe that a foremost way of addressing some of those concerns in developing countries, especially where there are still many craftsman-type industries and a lot of hand-oriented work, is to recognize the time span for change, but to also help employees recognize the hazards and start correcting them little by little. And by doing so, you make incremental improvements which are beneficial in the long run. Attempting to make massive change, changing processes, tools, or equipment, sometimes it's confusing. Little change, recognizing the physical nature of hazards, oftentimes improves the recognition of the stressful nature of work, and ultimately there are some improvements to health and productivity.
The next question comes from Mexico's capital, from the Comisión Federal de Electricidad. Good morning. The lack of medical insurance and the threat of layoff, the mistreatment of the employer could be considered as health hazards. What do you recommend in that situation?
Well, let me see if I can expand on the question first. If there is an issue of concern for unemployment, is that concern due to change in processes or technologies, or just simply an economic-related issue?
Bien, y ahora nos trasladamos a Panamá. La siguiente pregunta es formulada desde la Universidad Tecnológica de Panamá. Lo escuchamos. Panamá.
Panama, are you there?
Parece que se ha perdido la llamada. Volvemos a insistir. Panamá, ¿está usted en el
Panama,
teléfono?
are you on the phone? Yes, good morning. Hello?
Sí, un
Buenos
poquito más
días.
duro, por favor.
Buenos días. Hablen más fuerte.
Buenos días.
Good morning. My question is the following. Have you evaluated the way in which a retirement plan can affect the productivity and health? For example, stress and the work environment. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I will need clarification on the first part of that question.
Clarificación. Okay. Have you evaluated the way in which a retirement plan could affect productivity?
Oh, there are, I don't know if there are direct statistics to that. I believe that's a great question because retirement plans and benefits generally speak to an employer's value of workers and the value they place on particular tasks. I do not know of any particular statistics on the retirement piece specifically, but clearly the entire benefits package that workers are provided opportunities to have do make them more comfortable with their work. It creates less stress overall and kind of the social aspect of work, and we could make some very strong inferences to the benefits of that, yes.
Saludamos ahora a los participantes en esta
Let's greet now
televideoconferencia
to the participants in Aguascalientes, Mexico, from the Instituto de Seguridad y Servicios Sociales para los Servidores Públicos.
Viene la siguiente pregunta.
And this is the question. Sí. ISO 14,000, ISO 9,000 talk about what Mr. Dr. Daniel Hopwood have talked about. I would like to ask whether these are compulsory regulations and if whether ISO 18,000 is going to come into effect in the near future.
I am not familiar with ISO 18,000, so I can't answer that part of your question. However, organizations in the United States have become partners to ISO 9000 and ISO 14,000 for mutual benefits with international partners, the government, and the ability to produce things effectively and keep people safe. So to that extent, I do not know that any of them are mandatory standards to comply with. However, they are being accepted very clearly in many aspects of our industries and economies as being a beneficial piece to accomplishing business activities.
Let's go now to Brazil. From Sao Paulo, we received the following question from Fundación Carlos Alberto Fasolini. Go ahead.
Hello?
Hola.
Yes, can I speak? Yeah. Well, I'd like to make a question
Quisiera hacer
about the search for more productivity. And as we saw in our studies, the increase of productivity in the service sector in Brazil is made with a lot of measures based on intensification of work, adoption of rigid standards of behavior, and a heavy control of operators. Well, unfortunately, many times the results are not positive. We can see an increase of suffering with an important incidence of cumulative trauma disorders and other health problems, a decrease of quality, especially concerning the relationship with clients, and finally the result is a loss of productivity. Well, what do you think about changing the way people work, changing the organization of work and the process of working?
That's a great case study that you've mentioned, and it is a particular dynamic that's played out over and over again in the service economies. Two or three things come to mind, and you've mentioned them. That's a well thought out question and case study again. The organization of work, as I mentioned in my talk, is essential to look at. And part of the organization of work in terms of how we control exposures might be dealt with from the standpoint of the administrative control aspect. Unfortunately, I did not spend time discussing administrative controls, although I did in last year's presentation. That tends to be a strong way of controlling exposures where economics, in other words, the availability of funds, time, and resources are limited. And by looking at administrative controls, you involve many workers in similar tasks. You have advantages with cross-training. And very quickly what we do is we also reduce the element of exposure to injury and illness at the same time. And we see some benefits from a productivity standpoint, or at least if there's a fall-off, it's much smaller, but we have more workers involved in particular tasks.
Damos ahora la bienvenida a nuestros vecinos en la ciudad de Tijuana. La siguiente pregunta
Mexico. The following question comes from the Universidad Iberoamericana, Campus Noroeste. What are the specific consequences on health from the practice of hiding information from dishonesty and hypocrisy at work? First, how does that affect the subordinate workers, and also how does it affect the boss?
That's a tremendous question. I'm not sure that there is a real quick answer to it, but it is relevant to many things, I think including our discussion of violence in the workplace. What we know from the dynamics of workplace security or violence issues is that when there is a lack of involvement, a lack of control of one's own processes, ultimately stresses build up and they must be relieved somewhere. Sometimes these are played out in violence, and that tends to, I believe, speak to your question on consequences. Hypocrisy, trust, not being honest with workers, especially about change, will ultimately, in deference to the title of the program, impact productivity. But also, there must be a way for that stress to come out, and sometimes workers simply become ill. Others do manifest in violent or unusual behaviors, and that's a quick way of seeing if something's going on, is to look at changes in behavior of workers. I think that's a tremendous question, and one that would take a while to really get into in depth. But honesty and integrity with workers from the bosses is an essential element of safety and productivity.
And
from Tijuana, we go now to Bolivia, South America. From the Universidad Privada Boliviana, Cochabamba, we have the following question. Go ahead. Good morning. From the Universidad Boliviana, we've talked a lot about health management and that we need to achieve a change of mindset. My question is, how can we start implementing this change in the workforce in countries where the union elements are so strong?
Thank you. That's a good question as well, and we have experienced that dynamic here in the United States. I believe what the unions, the labor management relationship, have found to be successful is the inclusion of all parties in process. And as soon as that bond is broken, workers, management, and their union representatives, things do start to fall apart. Therefore, from a strategic perspective, the changes that are successful, they come slowly, they start slowly. They recognize, as I noted in my talk, that health impacts and improvements in work, in benefits, whether it's pay or health insurance, whatever the case may be, come slowly and along a continuum. Again, we must have mutual goals and objectives, and that works for acute injuries, the reduction of health impacts, as well as the improvement of benefits on the job. But I certainly have seen successful labor management relationships develop when the goals were objective, measurable, everybody was on the same page, if you will, and were willing to take things one step at a time.
The next question comes from Tlaneplanta, from the state of Mexico. Good morning. I would like to know if there is any correlation between the frequency in which work illnesses if there's any correlation between the illnesses from work and the cities where there's a high level of pollution.
Thank you. I know of no direct relationship. However, it is clear that we can make some inferences on the inability of workers to recover from tasks. And what I mean by that is the following. If you work and you go under certain stresses, and normal stresses that we go through at work, we become tired, we become fatigued. Environmental stressors can only serve to compound that. And we need our time off of work to recover from the processes of work, to enjoy life, to rest and be ready to work again the next day. So clearly environmental stressors, whether it's pollution, noisy environments, whatever the case may be, the more we can minimize those, the more prepared and ready we will be to work. We will be aware, we'll be healthy, and we'll be more productive.
Let's hear now a question from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, Facultad de Medicina, Veterinaria and Zootecnia. Good morning. From your experience, what would be a basic program that could be implemented at a service company to avoid the work stress of the employees due to their daily interaction with their audience or their clients?
If I may, a little expansion. Are we concerned about perhaps violence in the interaction with work, our consumers or constituents?
Perhaps, no, not violence, but perhaps that due to the problems that could arise among the same workers that are dealing with the public or vice versa.
Okay, one strategic approach, and if I may address this in a general way, that we can take is to recognize how we control our exposures. And one way to control exposures to injury and illness is to understand the physical dynamics. I don't know what industry you're in, but if we know the physical dynamics of work, we can insert controls for each one of them. For example, in the hospitality business, there is the exposure to repetitive motion for those in the housekeeping departments. And there are ways to control their exposures by using carts with good wheels, by having two people do turn-down processes in beds. The second one really deals with administrative controls, and that again talks about employee rotation, that type of thing. The third piece of that, let me go back and say we have physical controls that I mentioned. We have the administrative controls, only one example of which is job rotation. A third way to look at how we can control the exposure tends to deal with training. People must understand the process, understand the hazards, particularly from the standpoint of recognizing when those hazards exist. And if they do, the training program will address that. And by integrating all three of those aspects, we then improve safety and productivity.
Nos trasladamos ahora a Guamúchil, estado de Sinaloa.
Let's go to Guamúchil now, state of Sinaloa, Mexico. The question comes from the Colegio de Bachilleres, state of Sinaloa. Yes, good morning. My question is the following. How can we prevent that the implementation of health measures cause stress due to the risk of not achieving their goal?
Okay, let me just ask one question. Are we talking about incentive-based work where you make more based on how much you produce?
Okay.
I'm sorry, we've lost the question, but
that there are some risks of the fear of not achieving or not reaching the expectations of this new program.
There really are, I believe, one or two ways to address